also streaming to YouTube. Okay, there we go. The time is 11 o'clock. Welcome to our local, there we go. Welcome to our local officials advisory committee meeting. Today is June 7, 2022. Commissioner Katie Jacobson has joined us, and Director Brenda Bateman.
Well, welcome everybody. I'm Katie Jacobson. I'm a county commissioner here in Lincoln County, as well as a land conservation and development commission member. So I just want to take a chance to welcome everyone to our local officials advisory committee, or LOAC for short, for the Department of Land Conservation and Development. And first, I wanted to introduce our new DLCD Director Brenda Bateman, who's joining us today. So do you want to take just a minute and introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. Good morning, everybody. I'm Brenda Bateman. I'm the newish director at DLCD, having joined a month ago now, beginning of May. It's a pleasure to be here, and I will say I've been watching this group for a little while. I saw your last meeting as you were convening and coming back again into this space. I'm very excited about the idea of reinvigorating LOAC and what that could mean for our local relationships and the work that we can do together. I know that as we are kind of coming back into this culture, we'll be exercising some muscle memory and trying to remember, you know, some of the things, some of the best practices and efforts that we used before, but then we'll also be building new muscle. And so I'm looking forward to doing that work together with each of you. I will let you know that I'm hoping to travel some this summer and fall before getting trapped here in Salem for the long legislative session. And I'd like to connect with each of you and get to know you better. If there are folks that you think that we should be connecting with and would like to bring them along, that would be great. But you can expect me to reach out and try to build those connections. I very much want to get to know each of you more beyond this meeting space as we work together in the future. So thank you for the welcome, Commissioner, and I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. And I think I've told you this 3 or 4 times at least, but just a warm welcome to DLCC. It's great to have you. All right, so I think now we're going to do introductions of LOAC members. Esther, do you want to maybe take attendance or kind of go down the list and people can introduce themselves as you call their name?
Yes. Okay. Counselor Bielostowski.
Hey, I'm here. Hi, everybody. I'm Rory from City of Westland.
And Counselor Catherine Bisco.
Good morning, everybody. Counselor Catherine Bisco from the City of Philomath, so just outside of the Corvallis in the Willamette Valley area, and very glad to be here with you also. And welcome, Director Bateman. We're glad to have you on board.
Commissioner Nancy Wise.
Good morning, everyone. Nancy Wise, Benton County Commissioner, and I'm happy to be here today.
Okay, and I currently do not see Commissioner Cole Willis with Marion County and Commissioner Melissa Lindsay. And actually, I'm sorry, I recall that that Commissioner Cole Willis will not be able to join us today.
Okay, thank you, Esther. All right, I think we're moving on to our policy agenda updates, and I think Lisa Phipps, our coastal policy specialist, is our first speaker.
Actually, Commissioner, do we have other folks on the line? I think we had a couple of special guests maybe that we'd ask to sit in with us. Do we have other folks that want to introduce themselves as well? I think I saw Ariel there.
Yes, we do. We have and I can list their names if they want to do a introduction. We have Ariel Nelson.
Hi, good.
Okay,
Thanks, Esther. Hi, good morning. I'm Ariel Nelson with the League of Oregon Cities. Really excited to see the LOAC, the Local Official Advisory Committee, up and running again. It hadn't been meeting since I think 2018. So I believe this is the second meeting of the new body. And I believe LOC and our partners at AOC have had a role in kind of supporting the work of the members and the partnership with DLCD. So looking forward to building on that going forward. Thanks for having me.
thank you. And Michael Burdick with AOC.
Hi, I'm AOC's Legislative Affairs Manager for Community Development and Public Safety.
Okay. Commissioner Jacobson, I don't see anyone else on our panelist list. We do have DLCD staff that have joined us. We have Patty Snow, our Coastal Division Manager, Palmer Mason, who is our Senior Policy Advisor, David Michael, who is our IT, and then Lisa Phipps.
Thank you, Esther. All right, I think now we're ready to jump into our policy agenda updates. So Lisa, with our Coastal Policy Specialist, I think you're up first.
Great. It's nice to be here today. So Lisa Phipps, Coastal Policy Specialist for the department. And I am here in lieu of Meg Reed, our Coastal Shore Specialist, who's on a much needed and deserved break this week. And I'm here to talk about some rulemaking that we've initiated around Goal 18 and oceanfronting public road protections. I do have a PowerPoint, but you're going to be looking at PowerPoints all day. Would you like me to do it, or can we just have a conversation? Commissioner Jacobson, do you have a preference?
Well, I have to say I sort of like PowerPoints because
Okay.
I'm a visual learner. So maybe if you want to put it up and then maybe not just read it to us, but put it up so we have something to look at, and then we can go through what you have to say as well. I think that would be helpful. Thanks.
Yep. Okay. Let's get this in. There we go. Can everybody see that? Okay, great. So I'll just do a quick overview around Goal 18 itself. If you're not in a coastal community, this may come as a bit of a unknown to you. Talk a little bit about some of the ocean shore challenges that we have around beaches and dunes, particularly when it comes to shoreline armoring and traditionally known as riprap for most folks. About a focus group that was pulled together a couple years ago, and ultimately what came out of that, which is this rulemaking, which will be going in front of the Land Conservation and Development Commission this coming September. So Goal 18's main goal is to guide protection and developments of our beach and dune areas, highlights prohibition areas, dune grading requirements, beachfront protective structures, as well as providing just overall framework for how our beaches and dunes play into the general ecosystem of the coast. One of the key pieces of this, of Goal 18, is its limitations around shoreline armoring. This is a great picture. This is what we traditionally think of when we think of shoreline armoring, the large rocks called riprap. And back when the goal was instituted, it stopped the allowance of riprap on structures that were built after January 1st, 1977. So anything prior to that is eligible for riprap. That includes houses, vacant lots, but they had to be part of subdivisions. It's that is an area where there can be some questions. It's less clear than where you actually had structures present on the property. This is just the Ocean Shores online viewer. This just gives you an idea of This is a great tool in general. So if this is something you want to jump onto afterwards because you want to learn more about the ocean shores, this is a great tool. But what it really helps us understand is the statistics around shoreline armoring. And I don't need to read this to you except to say a great deal of the coast is not eligible for armoring under our current goal 18 eligibility requirements, and that the bulk of armoring is located within 3 areas, all entirely on the north coast, at least in the north coast region as defined by DLCD, which includes Clatsop, Tillamook, and Lincoln counties. And so what's left in terms of eligibility are 42 miles of coastline. We're not talking about a large area for consideration, but this is what you'll see later is we're going to be talking more about some real key infrastructure concerns that were raised over the course of the last few years around shoreline armoring. So a pre-development focus group was convened back in 2019 to explore the issues of shoreline armoring, whether it was being applied consistently and equitably, some of the on-the-ground challenges that come up, and one of the more common is when you have 2 properties bordering a middle property. The 2 properties on the outside are eligible for armoring, but the one in the middle is not. And you know, what kind of equity does that provide in terms of does that armoring negatively impact that mid property, and you know, what ways are there available to that landowner to have some kind of protections on their property that are outside of armoring at this point. And there were 4 main areas that were considered, but the one we'll focus on today is around public infrastructure built prior to 77, with the main focus on public roads and especially Highway 101. Oops. So currently public roads are not eligible for shoreline armoring. And the question put forward to that focus group was, should it be? Should we revisit the definition of development? Should we consider these public roads eligible for this shoreline armoring option? And in order to do so would trigger the need for a goal exception. The group agreed that this should be fleshed out further. And so the policy team approved the concept for rulemaking, which led us to the initiation of the rulemaking process by the Land Conservation and Development Commission in July of 2021. The specific reason for the public roads, excuse me, I forgot it away. The specific reason was to address public roads constructed prior to 1977. So again, this will not apply to anything after 77, but so many of our road systems are in place and have been so for a long time, particularly 101. And so one of the keys elements of this is to create a reasons exception through the goal to exception process, to continue, however, to honor the principles of goal 18, and then look for these exception areas to be adopted into local comprehensive plans, and understand a little bit more around how our transportation system, as it moves forward, needs to be cognizant of how it's impacting our coastal shoreline. So this is public roads, whether it's state or local, whether county or city roads. This does not apply to private roads. So a pretty robust rules advisory committee was created, representing a variety of perspectives. It felt pretty holistic, particularly when the conversation started. And 3 meetings were held. One of the things that the rulemaking advisory committee had to consider is what really are we talking about in terms of the need for armoring? And you see here that we're looking at approximately 55 miles of road that may or may not be experiencing erosion, but could in the future, particularly given sea level rise. The timeline for the rulemaking committee was that the first meeting was held in December. By the end of March, they had created some draft language, which has been continuing to be tweaked as public comment comes in. Our first geographic hearing is going to be held in Newport in August of 2022. And then our first public hearing is scheduled right now for September's LCDC meeting. It is possible that it could be a one meeting, a one hearing issue, but should a second hearing be necessary, that's been scheduled for November, at which point, if the LCDC adopted it, it would become effective. So Meg Reed is the point of contact for this particular project, but I'm happy to answer any questions. What I will highlight is in the language which is available on the website. Hopefully you had a chance to look at that as part of your packets, but I will say that the requirement is, again, specific to public roads, so that it could be federal, tribal, state, county, city government, or special districts. It is not geared towards roads that dead end at the shore, but rather run parallel to it. And that this would require a reasons exception should this move forward. The process that an applicant would go through is a reasons exception. And what we are asking is that there's justification that identifying a significant public benefit to protect the road. The applicant's going to need to go through a feasibility study, including looking at all of the other options that could essentially end in the same outcome, which is protecting the transportation system. But could the road be relocated? Are there non-structural stabilization methods that may be applicable in this particular area? We'll be asking that they do an impacts analysis. So not only looking at the environmental piece, but visual impacts, access impacts, potential impacts to neighboring properties. We're going to ask that they are considering sea level rise and other climate change effects that may be triggered along the coast. And the idea of mitigation, which is new from our perspective in the conversation around armoring and the potential for compensation. So potentially creating a new access point if armoring would eliminate an access point, or looking at key habitats where, in spite of having a very special habitat, the need outweighs the habitat component. What kind of mitigation opportunities are there to either enhance at that location or at another location? And so those are actually pretty innovative in the sense of shoreline armoring, in that we haven't had those conversations before, and it's not part of the general dynamic around shoreline armoring.
And Lisa, we do have a hand up. I want to hold discussion till the end, but if you have a quick question, Rory, that you want to ask, I do see your hand up.
Thank you, Commissioner. I was just wondering, and maybe this is for discussion later, but who funds these sorts of armoring improvements or comprehensive plan amendments? Because I can see from the perspective of a smaller coastal town, it might be hard to fund armoring or comprehensive plan adjustments. You know, that if we make it available through this policy change, how do the communities get funding to put these sorts of changes in place to protect the road?
Sure. So there's two questions there. There's the, how does a local jurisdiction deal with it from a planning perspective, and then how does it how does it play out on the ground in terms of the funding opportunities? And so from a planning perspective, if this is adopted, then what it means is that it won't necessarily require any comprehensive plan amendments simply because of the rule change. Where the change would happen is if an applicant, so ODOT, comes in, wants to make this exception application, they go through the process, and if successful, that exception would then be adopted into the local comprehensive plan as part of that whole process. So the permitting fees and everything else should help offset that kind of cost to the local government. In terms of the riprap, the applicant is responsible for the cost of that project, just like any other infrastructure project. And so currently, a private landowner is responsible for covering the cost. And as you can imagine, we're talking about sometimes rock that is not an exaggeration, but car size, depending on the situation. And it is very costly, and quite often in private property situations, a group of landowners will band together to address erosion so that the cost is spread out. But it is expensive, and that would simply be built into the cost of doing business. So they'd plan for it at budget level. There may be dollars available through other funding sources, but that wouldn't come from like our department, for example.
Commissioner Jacobson, this is Esther. I just wanted to share that Commissioners Holm Willis and Commissioner Melissa Lindsay has joined us.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Esther, and welcome to the both of you. All right, Lisa, go. We'll let you get back to your presentation there. Thank you.
Sure. No, actually, that was kind of a down and dirty. I was told to kind of keep it to around 5-ish minutes so that we could open it up for conversation, because you have a pretty full agenda today. But are there any other questions? Those were really good questions, Councilor Bielatoski.
If people want to raise their virtual hand, that kind of helps me find you if you have a question. All right, Commissioner Weiss, go ahead.
Thank you. I apologize if I missed this earlier or if I didn't read it in some of the information that was sent out, but what are the downsides to armoring? What's like the negative consequences?
Yeah, and I'll certainly open the floor up to our program manager as well, but shoreline armoring really affects the dynamics along the coastline. So in a natural situation, your dunes would move pretty regularly. They accrete, they erode. It's a natural process. When we fix the shoreline, we start to take away the opportunity for that sand transfer. So it can eat away at the beach, which can create hazardous situations from a public access perspective. In Nescoin, in the winter, for example, we had such extreme erosion rates of the beach because of the fixing of the shoreline that the beach was only accessible in the winter under very, very low tide conditions. Otherwise, it's very dangerous. It also has off-site impact. So once that's fixed, the ocean needs somewhere to go. So it will start to move up or down, starting to erode other properties that maybe had not been at risk. It can certainly affect the beach habitats and the dunal systems in terms of the ecosystem benefits. And in the world of sea level rise now, so you're going to start to see increasing wave heights, which are certainly going to influence public access, and then potential overtopping. And so what does that mean to properties not only on the beachfront, but properties behind it as well? And Nescoin's a really good example, if you've ever been there, of how that beach system can be negatively impacted. So I don't know if you'd like to add anything else, Patty. But that's a great question. Thank you.
I think you summarized it well, Lisa. Just, affects the beach, that we see downgrading of the beach where there's been riprap placed and ultimately access to it. And adjacent landowners can be adversely affected by the riprap. So I think that's, I thought Lisa did a good job of summarizing. Thank you.
This might be more information than you want, but there are littoral cells, and so they're from headland to headland. And the idea is that sand moves within that system. So in the summers, you see accretion along the beaches, and in the winter, you tend to see erosion, and it's cyclical. And when the beaches are open, it's a pretty consistent cycle. And once you trap that sand's no longer available. And so it just starts to take more and more from areas that would normally say accrete. It starts to take more and more sand away from those areas, increasing landowner problems up and down the system. So it's really interesting. And if you didn't have to worry about people and structures, it's pretty fascinating. But the whole point of it is we're protecting people and structures when we armor.
Any other questions? I don't see any other hands up. Oh, now I see hands up. Okay. Let's see. I see a hand up from our director. I'm not sure who had a hand up first. Go ahead.
I'll actually go last because I realized I was supposed to provide some context to the whole day. So I'll come back and do that in a moment.
Okay.
Sorry.
I just kind of took over. Sorry about that. All right. And Counselor Bisk, I think your hand is also up or was up.
Thank you, Commissioner Jacobson. I'm curious, so I did look at the public comments packet that was included with some of this information, and I did see a lot of concern about that intertidal areas and those potential impacts environmentally to if we were to do shoreline armoring. I also read, and I'm now hearing it again as well, as to that movement, the impacts to other property owners if we were to arm certain segments of the beach, those impacts to maybe down coastal line or up coastal line properties as well. How much of that is able to be captured in the requirements of the studies or the analyses that would be required if we were to allow these exceptions? I know that's kind of hard to maybe nail that down, but if I was one of those property owners potentially that might be impacted, or even looking at the environmental impact and those 55 miles that potentially we could be talking about on the state of Oregon, that also impacts recreational users as well. And so, how do we quantify those potential impacts as to whether or not this is really gaining that benefit that we're hoping to achieve, that public benefit in protecting of properties and structures and individuals?
So thank you. That's a really good question. And so there's two ways we're trying to get at that. The first is through the feasibility assessment, which is going to require the applicant to justify why there are no other options. And so that's the first piece. The second is the impact piece. And so one of the, in evaluating the beachfront structure, they're going to be asked to look at minimizing the effects of water currents, erosion, accretion patterns. They're going to have to incorporate sea level rise and other shoreline influence climate change impacts. And they need to look at it over the lifetime of the beachfront protective structure. So they're going to have to take a pretty broad view of their project. And what makes this interesting, I guess, is that if your property was built and committed before January 1st of 1977, you have a structure there, you really don't have to go through that level of analysis. It's allowed. There's still criteria that you need to meet, but it's an allowable use. And this is really the first opportunity that we've had to talk about sea level rise in the context of these structures and meeting this through this exception process. So the exception process sets a very high bar, you know, purposely. And if they can make it through those steps, you know, that the expectation would be that they are doing what is available to us with the knowledge that we have at this time to minimize the impacts that you're talking about. My guess is that an agency like ODOT or particularly local governments are going to be really, really thoughtful about coming forward with this kind of request, because my guess is it would be really their last resort if possible, just because of the time and the public process, right, and everything else that comes with that. If they can minimize that kind of conflict, I think that that's going to be a goal that they're going to try to achieve. Did that answer your question? Okay. Oh, I'm sorry, you're on mute. Yeah.
I was, that was helpful. Just one follow-up question to that. Was there a specific project that was the catalyst for this rulemaking, this proposed rulemaking change? Was there specific? I know Highway 101 north of Newport is one of those areas near that Beverly Beach. It's been that kind of continual erosioning, but was there another reason why this is now occurring, this conversation about the rulemaking?
Well, there was the initiation of this pre-development focus group around goal 18 that was really just looking at the application of armoring along the coast for all types of land. So it wasn't just at that time specific to roadways. That was one of the areas that came out in the focus group. And so then after further discussion, and recognizing sort of that whole public infrastructure and public safety and public benefit need, I think that really was a trigger. You can't get the Beverly Beach out of your mind though whenever you're talking about it. But Patty, would you know, was there a specific incident that maybe highlighted it more than others?
Well, you know, ODOT has done quite a bit of work on this, and there's about, I believe, 6 sites along 101 that they're really where this might actually apply. I mean, we're actually looking at a pretty limited, ODOT doesn't want to do it either if they can help it, but there's about, and of course, Beverly Beach should be one of them, but there's about 6 sites, if I remember correctly, that their studies have identified that where they have ongoing issues with significant erosion. So but it's really primarily ODOT. I have not heard of any other ocean fronting roads that have been brought up. So really it is primarily ODOT that we've heard from that have looked into this.
Commissioner Weiss, I see your hand up.
So just to clarify from my understanding, the motivation behind this is about those 6 sites along the highway. If this change is made, ODOT still has to do the feasibility assessment and the impact study before it would be approved. So there's a chance they might not even qualify.
Yeah, there is a chance that they might not be able to make it through the land use process to a successful outcome from their perspective.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, and I just wanted to provide, I think I'm the only coastal member on this group, even though I'm on the DLCD commission. I was also asked to kind of be the coastal person. And so just to provide, I guess, a little bit of a coastal perspective. So my background is in ocean and coastal policy before I became a county commissioner, and I'm generally not a fan of armoring for the reasons that have already been discussed, that you pretty much just create more erosion issues somewhere else when you do that. So you might save property A, but you create increased erosion problems on property B, etc. So it literally kind of moves the problem down the shore, literally. However, I guess from a kind of putting on my coastal county commissioner hat, in that jurisdictional, and we have approved people for armoring in the past while I've been a commissioner, it's very hard. A lot of people do not qualify. And a lot of those applications and approvals are challenged legally. So it is not an easy process to get people through. Most people do not qualify for a goal exception. to do shoreside armoring. And so it is certainly not a given that people make it through that process and are allowed actually to armor, even if they're experiencing significant erosion and want to save their property. Wanting to save your property doesn't mean you automatically qualify. I think when it comes to coastal highways and 101 specifically, I think it's really important for everyone to understand that that is our vitality to communities. That's how we're connected specifically to each other. So my county runs from Lincoln City all the way down to Yahuts, and 101 is the road that gets you from the north end all the way down to the south end. And then our other, really important coastal highways are all the ones going inward, like Highway 20 that connects Newport, where I'm sitting now, to where Commissioner Weiss is in Benton County, and et cetera, and up the LC and over from Otis up into Salem. So those are all really important highways for us. Lots of people commute on them, live in one community, live in another, but also that's how goods and services are brought here. So that's how our groceries get here. That's how everything arrives here, is those coastal highways. I think Beverly Beach, which is the one Lisa had on her PowerPoint earlier, is always like the example that everyone uses, but that's not the only one. There are many parts of 101 that continually slip out into the ocean. About 10 years ago, we had a huge piece of 101 slip out between Newport and Depot Bay. No warning, no anything, just an entire piece of the section gone. And we were basically cut off from that part of the county for multiple months as it was rebuilt. So at this point in time, kind of I guess what happens with that highway and the approach ODOT has is road slips into ocean, road is rebuilt right next to the piece that slipped into ocean, road slips into ocean, road is rebuilt right next to where it slipped into ocean, and we just keep repeating this process. And while I think there was policy conversations that triggered this larger conversations about highway, I would say from a coastal community, there's also a climate change piece of this that's triggering those larger conversations. So as we see the effects of sea level rise, we are seeing more erosion. Higher ocean, especially on a high tide and with coastal storms, can reach higher places, can do more damage to those places. And so I think we as coastal residents are kind of saying this business as usual, road slips into ocean, rebuilt road, road slips into ocean, rebuilt road. It's probably not going to be working for us long term. And either we need to look at, even though there's a lot of impacts, could we possibly armor parts of those parts of that highway, or what's kind of the long-term plan with ODOT in terms of relocating those roads? And what I'm hopeful for is that this process will allow ODOT and going through that to look at armoring, to also weigh the costs and benefits of, okay, so what does it look like to just entirely move the strip on Beverly Beach? Maybe it's just, that's been cost prohibitive in the past, but maybe in kind of the cost and balance of that becomes an option. What if we just pick up the whole slat and move it back 2 miles and we loop around part of the town or whatever? So these are the types of coastal conversations around armoring that sort of need to happen, especially with the climate change and the impacts that we're seeing. So anyways, I just kind of wanted to give a coastal context to that. Is there any more questions on Lisa's presentation or armoring?
I'd just like to note that Steve Shipsey, our DOJ guru and counsel, is here, and he's been working with us lockstep in this process. I didn't know if you wanted to say anything, Steve.
No, I missed the presentation, but I appreciate the dialogue I caught at the end there, because it did capture much of what the rule intends, which is it's a reasons exception. So there will be an analysis that has to be done, and they will look at things like Commissioner Jacobson was saying, potentially relocating a road to a safer location if that's an alternative in a specific segment. But nice to meet everybody. I'm glad to have LOAC back together. It's nice to be here. Thanks.
All right, Director Bateman. would you like the controls back for a minute?
Just for a moment. Thank you, Commissioner. And just a couple of comments that I should have made in the very beginning, but I'm happy to make them now. I'm very excited about this particular discussion that we've just heard, because I think it's an example of exactly the type of discourse that we need to be having. I think there's important work to be done here, and I'm really excited that we have this venue to explore some of these issues. The context that I did want to provide in terms of the policy agenda, or the agenda for today, was that the LCDC Commission and staff have put together a really nice policy agenda and kind of laid out the things that are on our plate and in our portfolio that need to be taken care of over the next many months and years. And I actually haven't seen other agencies do it this way before. So I was very excited to come here and find this policy agenda really written out with almost a dashboard that accompanies it and kind of shows our commission, our staff, stakeholders, and partners where we are in process on many different conversations like this. So these first two conversations that we're having today are really constituting rulemakings that will eventually make their way to our commission before the end of this calendar year. And then what you'll see a little bit later on the agenda is a rulemaking around climate-friendly and equitable communities. That is a rulemaking that's actually scheduled to come to our commission this summer, so in July. And then a little bit further on, you'll see some examples of conversations around housing and wildfire that are ongoing conversations that are, currently have work groups and efforts around them that will continue to move forward and will come to our commission eventually as well, and also include very strong partnerships with other agencies and with our local partners too. So I just wanted to note as part of today's agenda that this is actually part of a broader policy agenda that I'm very excited about here at the department. I just think all of these conversations are timely and important, and I'm excited that we get to be in those conversations together on these issues. That's the context. Thank you.
Thank you. And any other questions about that before we move to our next agenda item? Okay. Next up is Master Plan Communities House Bill 2003 implementation.
Good morning, Commissioner Jacobson and members of the committee. My name is Ethan Stuckmeyer. I'm the Senior Housing Planner here at DLCD. I will be going over a couple of slides here for the Master Plan Community Rule Refinement Project that we've got happening currently. Real short presentation. I got 7 slides. One is the title slide and one is the closing slide. So it should be real quick. I'm happy to answer any questions about any of this. And I will provide you with a little bit of information on how you can continue to engage in this kind of process as we move forward here for the next commission meeting, LCDC commission meeting. So a little bit of context on what we're even talking about when we say master plan communities and how that falls into the greater scheme of housing planning in the state of Oregon. So this particular effort is captured under the umbrella of House Bill 2001. And I know that this may only be directly applicable to Councilor Bailatowski here, but please do let me know if you have any questions about how this might be applicable to your jurisdiction as well. So House Bill 2001 was passed in the 2019 legislative session. It is often described as the middle housing bill or related to single family zoning in the state of Oregon. And it has some thresholds associated with it in its applicability. House Bill 2001 only applies to cities outside of the Portland metro boundary of a population between 10,000 and 25,000. And then also cities greater than 25,000 as well, outside of the Portland metro boundary. But essentially, the bill requires that cities allow other types of housing, more dense types of housing than they traditionally have in their low density residential zones. So in particular, cities with population of greater than 10,000 must allow duplexes on every lot and parcel. That also allows for the development of a detached single family dwelling. cities greater than with a population of greater than 25,000 have to allow that duplex on every lot and parcel, but then also other types of middle housing, also kind of referred to as higher level middle housing, which is triplexes, quadplexes, townhouses, and cottage clusters in areas that are zoned for residential development or detached single family dwellings. So that is the context that we're kind of operating under here. House Bill 2001 required DLCD to go through a rulemaking process. The commission, LCDC, adopted those rules implementing House Bill 2001 at the end of 2020. The master plan communities portion of that rule is what we're talking about today. So it's specific portion of Oregon Administrative Rule within even a specific section of housing planning. So master plan communities and how those relate to middle housing is, as the commission was going through this adoption of rules related to middle housing, one of the questions that was raised by Rules Advisory Committee members and other stakeholders was, now that cities should be allowing these other types of housing in these low density residential zones, how does the city plan for infrastructure to accommodate that increased amount of housing that potentially could be built on a particular lot? So if now the paradigm is that a property owner could build up to 4 or more units on a lot, how does the city plan for the pipes, the roads, the stormwater management to accommodate that kind of increased development potential on those lands? And even more so, how do those cities plan for those infrastructure systems in areas that are new into the urban growth boundary or unimproved lands that have never been developed before? So in that rule adoption process, the commission adopted a rule that basically ties infrastructure planning to an expectation of density in those master plan communities. And the commission set forth kind of 2 different infrastructure planning expectations, which vary for cities inside the urban growth boundary for Portland Metro, and outside. So the expectation for cities to plan for infrastructure in those master plan communities within Metro would be 20 dwelling units per acre. That's kind of the assumption that they should be making and planning infrastructure around. For cities outside of the Portland Metro, that expectation is 15 dwelling units per acre. When we talk about a master plan community, we're really talking about large unimproved lands within an urban growth boundary of 20 acres or greater. So that's the frame that we're kind of talking about here for master planning in itself. One thing to note here, and this is really important about how we talk about this coming in the next couple of slides here, is that the master plan communities rules specifically is an option to local governments. So in lieu of kind of planning for infrastructure based on these 15 or 20 dwelling units per acre thresholds, a city could regulate middle housing in a master plan community the same way that they regulate middle housing throughout the rest of the city. But a city could choose to regulate it differently so that they have some certainty on what type of infrastructure they could be planning or they should be planning for in that area. So it is an optional piece of the Oregon Administrative Rules here. So the commission adopted this rule in December of 2020. And there was some at that time when the commission adopted this particular rule, they directed DLCD staff to come back to them within a year to provide an analysis of how that particular section of rule was working or if it wasn't. And we knew from pretty quickly and having ongoing conversations with local governments that this was an imperfect rule and that rule refinements may be necessary to tweak its implementation and make it actually a practicable rule. So part of this is we're planning for density in a master plan community and tying infrastructure assumptions to that density, some sort of density metrics, has a couple different unintended consequences or impacts on how cities actually do that infrastructure planning. So we know that planning for density and tying that to infrastructure is not a good match. If you're planning for 20 dwelling units per acre, that doesn't really have a real impact on the amount of infrastructure necessary to provide services to that particular density. So we knew that was there is a kind of a gap there in the data and the correlation between those. Additionally, if you're supplying infrastructure capacity across in a really one size fits all approach to units, you don't really take into account smaller units that are have fewer bedrooms, that have fewer people living in there, and that really has the outcome of frustrating affordable, fair, and equitable housing outcomes. And then thirdly, we know that infrastructure planning, there are so many different aspects of that planning process in local governments that adding this additional layer to that process was really tough for local governments to actually accommodate. And so it was really impractical for local governments to implement. So what did we do about it? So as part of that work with the Land Conservation Development Commission, we initiated this kind of rule amendment project. And basically, of course, the purpose of this was to balance the intent of House Bill 2001, allowing middle housing in areas, with requirements in rule in terms of how local governments implement that intent. That was a major balancing act. And then also would like to, as part of master plan communities, the process in and of itself, there is a tendency for that process to cement or concrete or really entrench a low amount or a suppressed amount of infrastructure capacity in those areas, so that you don't see kind of redevelopment of those master plan communities into additional or a mix of housing types. And so the process of planning for infrastructure at the beginning of the master planning process is best in terms of ensuring that those parts of our cities are not artificially limited in their capacity solely due to infrastructure that we've planned for. So DLCD convened a work group of about a dozen folks who were part of the initial rulemaking advisory committee to have some conversations about how we can tweak these rules to make it work better. So we had 3 meetings. The last one was just last week, and worked through some various policy options in how we could remedy some of these deficiencies in the rule. So what has come about of that that working group process? Basically, the overall theme of this, and I can summarize it in one word, is options. So the process that we're proposing here is kind of a 3-pronged approach, safe harbor approach for local governments to regulate middle housing within master plan communities. So as you're kind of looking at the screen here, there's 2 different trees here in terms of this decision-making flow. So a city would kind of start at the top here, determine how they would like to regulate middle housing in master plan communities. Like I mentioned previously, they could choose to regulate middle housing in those master plan communities the same as they do in the rest of the city. But we know that there's infrastructure planning issues with that approach, and you can't really plan for infrastructure adequately if you just kind of allow all sorts of development within those master plan communities. So there is an option for local governments to choose a different route in terms of how they might allow middle housing in master plan communities. That route offers 3 options, 3 additional options for how they might approach that. The first is what we've already talked about: go through that minimum plan density process, that threshold, that planning expectation of 15 or 20 dwelling units per acre. We know that there are known issues with that, but we maintain that option because some cities are already operating under that assumption. We've added 2 different options for local governments, or we're planning to add 2 different options for local governments to still apply different standards to middle housing and master plan communities, but still show compliance with the intent and spirit of House Bill 2001. And those 2 additional options are applying a variable rate SDC, system development charge structure, to middle housing, or really development generally in those master plan communities, or requiring some sort of mix of middle housing and other residential types in those master plan communities. What's really important to note here is that these are a series of options. There is no part of the rules that we're proposing that would require local governments to go through any one of these processes. And cities, I think, as as they're considering which option they would like to choose, could choose one or more of these options and apply a different option to one master plan community where it makes sense. Maybe the calculation of infrastructure demand is just different, and that variable rate SDC makes a lot of sense. We're in another part of the city that kind of calculation doesn't equate to a variable rate SDC, and they would like to go with kind of like a required mix of middle housing in those areas. So they can kind of mix and match, go through these different options. All right. That was really quick, really high level overview. Happy to answer any questions, but in terms of next steps, we are thinking about really the next 2 or so months here. These are kind of we're in the major kind of deliverable stage of this work. So like I said, we had our last meeting with the working group last week. We are currently working on refinements to those rules to get those ready for our Department of Justice review, and also for the working group to take a final look at those before they go to the Secretary of State, which is the required noticing for a public hearing by our commission. And that public hearing is scheduled for July 22nd. That's a first public hearing, and then they will vote, not vote at that July meeting, but vote at their September meeting, which is their next meeting after July. So we are in the midst of that kind of work right now, and you can either follow along and review those rules after they're posted on July 1st, or attend the Land Conservation and Development public hearing and provide public testimony if you so choose. So with that, I'm going to close it out, and I'm happy to answer any question that committee members might have.
Deputy Director Green, I see your hand up.
Hey, Commissioner, thank you, and good morning, everyone. Sorry to have had a conflict for that first half hour. I'm Kirsten Green. Good to see everybody. I just think, Commissioner, according to our bylaws, which of course we've been studying, it is appropriate to share any of the impact statements with LOAC members. So I suggest for both all 3 rulemakings that are under discussion today, we follow up with LOAC members and provide those fiscal impact statements in case LOAC members would like to provide comment on those. For CFIC, which is coming up this afternoon, the Rules Advisory Committee took a hard look at that before those were filed with Secretary of State. So we might just make those more kind of available as background and context, but these 2 are certainly still in play. Thank you.
Councillor Bisco has her hand raised.
Yeah, thank you, Esther. I realized I was on mute as I was trying to call her, so go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you for that again, Commissioner. So the presentation to Mr. Stuckmeyer, if you, the 3 options that you were presenting, that's perfect. Actually, that's exactly the slide. I know that one of the concerns that local governments have is the cost of that infrastructure, as you mentioned. And when we look in particular to those undeveloped potential parcels, and as it relates to master plan committee or communities, could you give an example of how a variable rate SDC option or the required mix of middle housing option might help cities address, again, that premier issue of how do we provide infrastructure for this increase in housing?
Yes, Councillor Bisco, it's a really good question. So underlying this work is the uncertainty that exists for local governments as they are going through that planning exercise to determine how big is this pipe that I'm putting in the ground to serve this master plan community, right? And there is high stakes in terms of making sure that is the correct analysis to ensure that you're providing that service to accommodate the development in that area. And so the existing rule, which is the planning for a density of 20 or 15 dwelling units per acre, doesn't necessarily get to the certainty that I think is necessary for local governments to actually determine what that infrastructure demand is going to be. And that's different in both the other 2 options. So for example, the variable rate SDC process would not necessarily address that certainty for development. However, it would address the actual financing of that infrastructure investment. And so a variable rate SDC, and there are all sorts of statutory methodologies that are associated with how cities and local governments establish those system development charges. They have to be reasonable. They have to be associated with the actual infrastructure demand of development. There's this all sort of analysis that's required to determine what that actual charge is. And so allowing cities to say, hey, we're going to go through this analysis and say, the actual infrastructure demand that we expect for a single unit in a middle housing development is somewhat different based on analysis that we can provide. When I say we, the local government can provide in terms of how much infrastructure demand is associated with that particular unit. So it allows jurisdiction to kind of play with the financing levers associated with that actual infrastructure investment. For the required mix of middle housing, this is really, really focused in on that certainty. So if a local government can say, any developer that would come to the city with a proposal for a master plan community, we are going to require that developer to show that there's going to be at least 30% or whatever the number they choose of middle housing development within the overall residential portion of that master plan community. And then on the back end, the city can say, okay, we know we have certainty in the number of units associated with that particular development. We now know how much infrastructure, how big that pipe needs to be in the ground to serve that particular development. And so we can kind of move forward without having to kind of over-invest in the infrastructure, which could potentially happen in this kind of first paradigm here. Answer your question?
That's helpful. Thank you.
Commissioner Weiss, I see your hand up.
Thank you. First of all, I really appreciate that there are options that I think it's always best to let cities kind of figure out what works best for them rather than the, one size fits all method. So thank you for that. Okay, I'm trying to figure out how to ask this question in the best way. I'm trying to picture how this would play out in real life. So when it comes to a city, will they, if they decide to go the route of the three options, are they able to apply different scenarios to different areas that are being planned for future development? Like in one area, could they say, we're going to go with the minimum planned density of 5 per acre, and then in this area over here, we're going to apply variable rates SDC, or is it they have to choose one and that's what's going to be used across the board?
Yeah, Commissioner White. Yes, it does make sense. So the way that the rules are proposed to be structured is there isn't any language that would require a local government to only choose one of these options. They could blend these types of options so that they could implement them in the way that makes sense for that either particular area of the city or citywide. And that's an option available to them and how they choose to implement that. One of the important parts of that kind of structure of framing the rules is that those standards as they're proposed to be written aren't prescriptive in the manner that would require, say, like a 25% variation in the system development charge for middle housing, right? It's really kind of non-prescriptive or unprescriptive in that manner, and says that this is an option available to cities and that they don't have to, there's no kind of burden of proof showing that the city has to kind of meet these various performance metrics to be in compliance with the statutes or the rules.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful to know. I appreciate that. And I think that sounds good.
All right, Rory, I see your hand up.
Thank you. Thank you, Ethan, for the great presentation. I was just wondering your sense of how many cities might actually adopt the rules that are being presented. From my city, I'm just trying to think. I don't think we have. I can't provide a lot of input because I don't think Westland has a 20-acre vacant parcel. So I was wondering what your sense of the local governments and the urban growth boundary that might go the route of the change?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think it remains to be seen a little bit. However, we've got several, let's see, Washington County and Clackamas County cities on our working group, and some Water Environmental Services, which is a service utility provider in Washington County. But I think, Wilsonville has been, the city of Wilsonville has been very involved in this process, and I think has a lot of, unlike Westland, probably has a large contingent of their land as master plan communities, and so it's really kind of important to them. But I think by providing additional options, I think we'll see more use and utility of this kind of process across the state, because the existing process, that kind of 20 or 15 dwelling unit per acre process, is tough, and it puts cities in kind of between a rock and a hard place. And so providing more options, I think we'll see more utilization of these options.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with Commissioner Wise in terms of the options are great. So I'm glad to see that happening, because if we did have 20-acre parcels, I'm sure we would appreciate the options. So thank you. Very informative.
Great. Commissioner Jacobson, if I could add one thing real quick. So in addition to these rules that are really focused in on master plan communities, 20 units per acre or greater, we've also had, over the course of really the last 18 months since the adoption of the rules, lots of questions from all sorts of different jurisdictions, whether it's metro or non-metro cities, about what do we do? How do we plan for this infrastructure in those sub 20-acre non-master plan community areas? The calculations are somewhat different. They're smaller, but we still have that uncertainty about how much infrastructure to apply. So we're providing in this actual overall project, providing some clarity and providing additional sections of the rule to kind of clarify the expectation for local governments as they're kind of going through the planning process for those sub 20-acre subdivisions, and just saying, formalizing the process that really kind of already exists, where there's coordination between the city and the property owner about how much development they might actually be proposing in those smaller subdivisions, and then also giving the city the ability to say, hey, look, you're changing your plan here, and what we planned for originally in terms of infrastructure is now going to be deficient, and we have to kind of work through a remedy to that deficiency. So just formalizing that process in OARs as well as one other kind of accessory part of this project.
Thank you. Any other last questions for Ethan? Okay, I think let's see, it's 12:08. I think at noon we were supposed to take a quick break. And I still would like to give people at least a little bit of a break to just get up and move around or whatever. So making sure we're kind of back on schedule here a little bit. Why don't we reconvene slightly off our agenda? Why don't we reconvene at 12:20?
Thank you.
All right, I'll see y'all back at 12:20. Thanks, bye. All right, welcome back, everybody. It looks like we have most of our participants back here, so I think we can go ahead and jump into our next topic here, which was climate-friendly and equitable communities, rules and implementation package, and Palmer Mason is going to be presenting that.
Thank you, Commissioner Jacobson, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for participating in LOAC. So yes, I'm Palmer Mason, Senior Policy Advisor at DLCD. I think most of you know quite a bit about, and maybe even heard quite a bit about, the climate-friendly and equitable community rulemaking. It's a rulemaking with a very large scope, so we only have 20 minutes. And I think in this discussion, what we're going to try to do with that 20 minutes is to focus on the implementation, and specifically the policy option package, which is another way of saying the budget request that the agency will be presenting to the commission and ultimately to the governor and hopefully the legislature in the next legislative session. I think that's the focus of our discussion today. I have also on this meeting is Cody Meyer. He's a land use and transportation planner at the department and is really more the expert than I am. I think I'm just serving as kind of the host for this conversation today. So I'm going to stop there and see maybe, Kirsten, if I missed anything else or if there's any other thing that we wanted to try to talk in the time that we have.
No, thank you. I think that sounds perfect. Just to remind LOAC members, we just touched on this in our quick fly through the policy agenda at our first meeting. Sent you guys some links. These are various, Palmer said, very big rules. That we have temporary rules in effect right now that Commission adopted at their May 19th meeting. Those are open. Those rule drafts are open for public comment until July 1st. So we certainly can recirculate out those links. It's a complex set of rules. So if anyone would like to have a one-on-one, please just let us know. And here we thought, because there's been 2 years of public process, and I think just one of our members here is subject to the bulk of the rules, Commissioner Willis, although it looks like he may have had to step out, or I didn't hear at the beginning of the meeting if he wasn't going to be on throughout. Well, Commissioner Willis, the Councilor Bisco in Philomath, and then Councilor Bielas, sorry, Councilor, I still need to get the pronunciation of your last name correct, so forgive me. But I think Westland is also, of course, subject to the metro area, kind of portions of the rule. Metro had, of course, climate smart communities and implemented similar rules about a decade ago. So there's just some parking rules and some other requirements that metro area communities are would be subject to. So we thought not to kind of focus the bulk today on a presentation about the rules themselves. Again, if folks have questions for us, please let us know. There's been a lot of process on that. As I said, the process is continuing. We're having regional meetings. So the metro area meeting is still being set. Cody could probably advise on when those other regional meetings are. We could follow up with you all in an email, but I would advise probably maybe try and catch one of those as well, or just hit staff up for an overview. But today, again, just wanting to focus on a pretty significant, well, there's a delta between what the rules require and what we're probably going to be asking for in our policy option package. So we'd like to sort of bring that forth to LOAC members today. Thanks, Palmer.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe before we go into taking comments, just to give a little bit of context around the budget request. I think in the information that was shared with the LOAC members, you saw a budget request that right now has the agency proposing something in the order of $3.9 million. That proposes 4 FTE at DLCD. And then, and probably what we want to talk about the most, it proposes $2.5 million in grant money to local governments. DLCD and the commission both have heard a lot on this point about the need for sufficient state assistance to help local implementation, of this rule. And I think we've heard the message loud and clear, and we realize that in particular, that $2.5 million in grant money is a number that we'd like to talk more about and hear more from local governments on, whether that's enough and it likely isn't, and how much more might be needed. So I want to share that with you. I will make a couple of points, and then we'll see if Cody has anything else, and then we can open it up for conversation. One thing to keep in mind about this rule is it is a rule that is phased over time. So I think when we get input from local governments about the need for state resources, it'd be helpful to be thinking about that as a number that would happen over 2 or even maybe 3 biennia. So that's just one thing to for sure keep in mind. And then the other is there's another pot of money out there that's very much related to this program, and it's money that the Department of Transportation has to the tune of about $15 million to help with the transportation system plan updates and the tools and modeling that are needed for that work. So when you hear DLCD talk about our budget request, it is not by itself the only state funding available for this program. So that's just another thing to keep in mind. And I'll stop and see, Cody, if you have anything quickly to add, and then I think we should open the floor up to comments and questions.
Sure, thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cody Meyer, land use transportation planner with the agency. Concerning the 15 million, I just want to add that there is an additional 3.5 that we've had to kind of implement other sections of the scenario planning transportation system plans rules. So that kind of does roll up to a larger chunk there. And that those, and as well as our agency budget requests, all sit on top of the existing funding streams that the state provides to local governments for land use and transportation planning. We have ODOT special transportation funds that fund most of the TSPs in the state, and updates, and the Transportation Growth Management Program, which also funds a lot of transportation system plans and different integrated land use and transportation planning.
All right, thanks, Cody. Let's open up the conversation here and hear from the LOAC members and either of our special guests who are on the call.
Anybody? I don't see any hands up yet.
Palmer, could you just hit those numbers again? I must have been kicking myself on my pronunciation challenges while you mentioned it, but we had a budget request for 2.5 million in grants that we put out for public review on our policy option packages this spring. So that number has been out there. So staff, and in it one staff person, and then in addition 2.5 million in grants. We're actively reconsidering that. Did you maybe Cody could bring a little bit of information about the process which is fueling that reconsideration, and if nothing else, I can show the local implementation guide, which is also the bedrock of fueling kind of compliance schedules, because I'm afraid we just didn't provide enough information to generate any questions even.
Well, I have to say I see some questions now, but I can quickly reiterate the numbers if that's helpful. So the initial proposal from DLCD was 3.9 million in total. 2.5 million of that was for grant money, and then there were 4 FTEs. Again, I want to reiterate, we've heard loud and clear about what is really, and is that number or those numbers the right numbers for what's needed in the way of state assistance, and we are going back to the drawing board. And I think we at DLCD are looking for more state staff to assist local governments and potentially a larger amount of grant money, maybe a substantially larger amount of grant money to assist local governments in the implementation. But again, I see some questions, and maybe out of respect for time, we'll try to start with those questions. So.
Okay. Yep. Okay, thanks. And I didn't catch who had their hand up first, but Ariel Nelson, I don't think you have asked a question yet today, so I was going to start with you. And you're muted.
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm on my phone. I've had internet problems. Sorry. I just wanted to share from the LOC's perspective. I know these conversations are ongoing and we have a meeting coming up later this week, which we very much appreciate. But the estimates coming from some of the larger cities implementing these rules is 5 million on the low end, and up to 7 or 8 on the higher end. It's a range, as these are really complex rules, and I think our members are still kind of wrapping their heads around how these will be implemented. And the other key consideration when looking at these funds is, the $15 million available at ODOT. We've received confirmation from them that due to the federal nature of those funds, that is all funding that ODOT will be using to help local governments implement. None of it will be available directly to local governments, either to support staffing or to bring on consultants that ODOT manage that on their end. So I know that is an issue for our members. So just wanted to put those pieces out there, and just the other piece of in terms of that $5 to $8 million range. Again, I think it reflects the complexity of the rules, and also different cities are in different stages of their plans in terms of how much progress they've made towards the goals of these rules, as well as a lot of the a big part of the rules is this very intentional, equitable community engagement, reaching underserved communities, and that work can be really intensive and time intensive and resource intensive. So we're getting some sharper numbers on that. The other consideration is the parking programs. The rules contain some pretty detailed parking program options, but parking programs are very expensive to stand up and manage and are typically not self-funded. So that's, I think, where some of the cost estimates are coming from as well. Just want to set that out there.
Yeah, thank you, Ariel. And I think we look forward to covering those issues with you in more detail and AOC members as well on Friday. So yes, thank you. Take other questions.
All right, Rory.
Thank you, Commissioner. I just wanted to clarify, is this I might have missed it, is this for grants for just the parking element of the rules coming up, or for all of the rest of the compliance with House Bill 2001?
I'll take a stab at it, and Cody can correct me if I'm mistaken. So what we were talking about, this $2.5 million, which again is very much under discussion and likely to be a larger number, is intended to be all the phases of the rule, but it's a biennial only number, right? Because again, this is a program where the work is done over time. In fact, there's even an option, I think, if you take the work, if a city chooses or a county chooses to do the work plan option, work program option, the dates could even be, pushed further out. So we're only really talking about the work that would be done in 23 to 25. And I think that's mostly, again, Cody can correct me if I have this wrong, mostly work around the climate friendly areas, and maybe some parking as well. But I guess, again, Cody, correct me if I'm wrong, in theory, the money could be available for other phases of, or other aspects, of the rulemaking.
I think that's right, generally. And just a reminder, in the Portland metro area, the governments have done the Region 2040 plan concept. So we are not asking anything other than to adopt your required 2040 boundaries. So this largely does not apply to cities in the Portland metro area for the climate friendly area zoning.
All right, any other questions? Oh, Commissioner Weiss.
I'm sorry, could you give some specific examples of what the funds would be eligible to cover?
And maybe if I could just wedge in there, if Cody could, if you could, sorry, Commissioner, if Cody, if you could cover what is underway now for the definition of climate friendly areas, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, so the rules just generally start with a foundational element of land use. So trying to get cities and UGBs, primarily it's where the rules are aimed at in metro areas in the state within the UGB. So kind of dialing in there. foundational element is really getting land use first. So before any transportation system planning occurs, the first step is really getting compact mixed use development identified. In most cases, we know that cities are already planning for this work. So we're requiring a study to be done, and we have funds for this biennium to do a study to say, where is your city at now in reaching these kind of requirements to have 30% of your needed housing in a compact mixed use neighborhood type zoning. Then if you're at 30%, fantastic. You don't have to do anything. If there's a little bit of a remainder, where are the options and opportunities to do some upzoning? Looking at anti-displacement mitigation and risks there. So that's really that, and then doing some parking reform are the first steps that I think that we're really looking at. Of course, we have some transportation related work that we are working closely with ODOT to fund. And that's going to kind of take care of, I think the most expensive items on the list really are going to be the transportation system planning elements. So for DLCD's budget, I'll say that the 2.5 million we've identified already was like in grant funds. It's really primarily focused on the zoning and anti-displacement strategies, and then some parking reform. And I think that we're also just kind of open to other ideas on community engagement or other kind of land use related elements. But we just generally split it down the middle and say ODOT is handling transportation centric work and DLCD is handling land use related work.
All right, any last questions before we move on?
I guess I was just curious.
Go ahead.
I don't think that addressed my question. So, I mean, for me to get a sense of, how much money would be needed, what kind of things can the city actually put the money towards? Can you hire a consultant with the money? Can you, what are some of the specific things you can spend the money on?
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Weiss. Yeah, we have heard that having the agency procure consultants has been really desired because it takes a lot of overhead to do that. So what we're offering is to provide that service, a la House Bill 2001, is to provide consultants on contract at the behest of the cities. We are also open to doing grant funding straight to the cities if they want to procure their own or have staff do it internally. That's also an option. And another part here would be providing technical model code guidance, best practices, that kind of direct assistance, and then as well as having DLCD staff come in, especially for some of the smaller jurisdictions, working as kind of a free contract planner to help them get things done as well.
So just one more follow-up. I'm sorry. Is there anything else that the grant money could go to fund? Or is it really just that consultant or that staff work?
I think that's probably it. I mean, I think that we're kind of listening right now to see what other options might be out there. One thing that pops to mind is just an idea is contracting with community benefit organizations. I think the agencies at the state level have learned a lot on how to provide stipends or mini contracts to, compensate people for their time. Just kind of interested in hearing like what would be needed at the local level to support that kind of work as well. And then maybe that's a role that the agency could help kind of fill that gap, or at least, minimum best practices. The sky's the limit, I guess, is, trying to get help with contracting directly.
I would just amplify as well, if I could, that this excuse me, equitable community engagement is a major step forward. So trying to drive down greenhouse gas emissions and increase equitable outcomes, major focus and quite new in Oregon in practice. So some jurisdictions have been taking this work on, but there's also technical assistance available from staff and upcoming sort of guidance documents on what does this look like. So we're sort of on a journey together. But Commissioner, one of the things I have as a follow-up flag here too is to provide LOAC members the implementation table. I would call it a sort of a compliance table, but it goes jurisdiction by jurisdiction with what is necessary to comply with the rule. And I don't think anything's off the table in terms of what jurisdictions need to do to comply with the rule. That is the purpose of the funding, just writ large. So let us provide a little bit more detail in that regard as well. And we look forward to, any follow-up questions you might have as well. Sorry, Commissioner Jacobson, I know we have two other hands up. I'm gonna go on mute.
Thank you, Deputy Director Green. Yeah, we're at 12:41 and we end at 1, and I'm a big believer on ending on time. So let's try to work through this. But Commissioner Lindsay, you have a hand up.
Actually, I think Deputy Green kind of answered a little bit for me. I was, trying to keep on my local officials advisory, and I just was going to ask kind of to gain an understanding of how, since I'm not the last topic and this topic kind of in larger metro areas or larger cities, I was just curious, are these the last two things being kind of perceived or taken as, wow, thank you, we were trying to get to this work and this is the direction we wanted to go, and happy to have some help to get there? Or are these things coming at them as this wasn't really how we were going to get there, or even a direction we had in our sights, scrambling, I guess, to fit into the rulemaking? You answered it a little bit, but I was just curious, maybe that's forthcoming in the future, and I'm a little ahead of myself on that question.
Well, in terms of LOAC role, Commissioner Lindsay, like what are we looking for in terms of your advice to us? Is that your question?
It was just more what is the reactions of these large metro cities in trying to jump into these rules that may or may not be completely on their horizon in the way
right.
It's
I wouldn't be for, I should let Palmer answer because he's always better at answering than me in general, but I would say it is a considerable piece of work. We've been hearing a lot from local governments as well from LOC. So it's a considerable body of work. There's been considerable concerns about the rules. Change is hard. It is time consuming, and folks have been working to comply with House Bill 2001, 2003. So we are hearing a lot of struggle for sure as we work to kind of update our best practices for the 21st century, so it is hard. I would definitely affirm that. Palmer, I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, I think you're right. It's been a challenging time to be in local government with the pandemic and inflation and a long litany of challenges. So this is, as Kirsten says, a significant body of work, and it does, for those communities, will make, big changes, but we also hope meaningful changes. I think that's why we have taken to heart the concern about, is the state stepping up financially in the right way? And so we're trying to dig deep into that issue and lean in and get more conversation. I think you may have heard, Commissioner, that we have a meeting set up later this week with representatives, both government affairs and technical staff from LOC and AOC, to have a further conversation around what are the real, true financial needs of the communities, and more importantly, what does the state need to do to be, a good partner? And we realized where we started was not enough. And so that's why we want to have that conversation later this week. And there is, the public comment period is open through July the 1st. So we, encourage people to continue to provide comments both around the financial side as well as the substantive side. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you. That was exactly what I was looking for. I appreciate that.
All right, Councilor Risk, I think you're last with your hand up.
I'll just, with respect to time, just a quick comment. So when I'm looking at the draft implementation work plan a little bit, my question first is just how many cities are we talking about that are going to be asked to implement these proposed rules, right? They're not solidified yet. Because when we're talking about, and I'm just quoting from the document, land use designations, parking requirements, transportation inventories, community outreach processes, prioritization and screening criteria, that's far more than just one consultant here or one consultant there. So concerns are, what's actually a realistic cost that's expected in this process? You've got multiple consultants likely, but we've also got burdens on staff. And I think I hear that that's somewhat being addressed, that DLCD is potentially going to provide some support there as well. But I will also say this, and this is going to peel away time from other municipal priorities, because we're going to all of a sudden now have these commitments from local government officials. So how are we balancing that? And do we have a realistic expectation of the costs of these types of planning processes? And to that point, how many cities actually are we talking about? And that ought to give us maybe a more realistic number of what types of funding should be expected to support this for our cities.
Cody, can you remind Palmer, do you have the number of cities?
I don't. I was going to ask Cody. I mean, I think I do, but I always defer to the expert. I'm just the legislative and government relations person. Cody should answer the question.
So the big number is 15. So there's 15, it's 14 cities in one county because we have Marion County has a large chunk of urbanized area in it. So that's the land use component. And that's the real big first step, is to take this zoning updates in those 15 jurisdictions. We're under contracts to get, the first phase of that. It is phased out, and the rules really, out of response to desires for flexibility and respecting differences in different sizes. I can't give you a number of 48, but we're really talking about probably 48 jurisdictions total. But that being said, the Portland metro area takes up the lion's share of that, and they've done a lot of this work, and they have to respond to changes from the metro government's regional framework anyway. So a lot of this stuff is really what's the marginal difference as people go to update a transportation system plan in the future, which, as I mentioned, the state is already paying for. So we're not requiring these 48 jurisdictions to get your TSP updated right away. We're focusing in on the next biggest metro areas. And so that is Eugene, Springfield, Salem, Kaiser. And we have funding to do those TSP updates in this first phase of work that we'll be doing. So it really is metered out over time, and considering DLCD's biannual budget and the amount people can take on locally, if we drop $10 million on a city, instead spend it in 2 years, it would be an impossibility. It would cause more problems than solve anything. So we really are taking a long-term look at this. And I think you'll see our budget request is really reflective of that desire to meet folks where they are and phase things in over time.
Thank you. So given that we have about 12 minutes left here and still a couple of agenda items, one, I would say this generated a lot of discussion. I don't think we're done having that discussion because I still see Ariel's hand up, and I think we could keep going. So I'm going to suggest that maybe we bring this back to our next agenda, maybe with some updates, and continue discussing this, because I feel like we're not done having the discussion. So let's put this on our agenda as a placeholder for the next time and pick it back up. Also, just with the time left, Deputy Director Green, do you want to try to jump into bylaw review? Do you want to move that to the next agenda? How would you like to proceed there?
I think we could do a tiny bit of both, if that's okay. So just, I feel most urgently that we should put out the call for chair and vice chair. So it's not really bylaw review, but it is an invitation. And maybe that's just a reminder that as we go forward, really one of the biggest, it was in your packet and in the email, but one of the biggest things that we appreciate about a chair and vice chair is the agenda development process. So our next meeting is September 12th. Esther has kindly anchored down 2 more meetings this year. They're each just 2 hours. You all know more than anyone else how incredibly busy you are. I think these, LOAC used to meet for a half day or a day or more. So you can see, I would ask, that when we have a chair and vice chair, those leaders also help us consider the length of meeting and talk to your fellow members and talk about, is 2 hours with considerable policy agenda that Director Bateman mentioned, is 2 hours enough to get kind of that meaningful advice that is in the bylaws, the purpose there in section 2. So perhaps Commissioner Jacobson, if folks could email Esther or me or you any interest they might have in a conversation about chair and vice chair, I'd be happy to follow up. And if folks could maybe do that within a couple weeks, then we would know if it was crickets and we needed to make some phone calls, or if there is anyone that would help opt in to really that agenda setting, helping us prioritize what to bring to LOAC would be really, really helpful. On the bylaws themselves, the issues.
Let's just say if people could nominate people and send emails to either yourself or Esther by the 21st. That's 2
Okay, great. Great. 21st. Thank you. Yep. Nominate self or others. That's always the easier one, isn't it? Good. Thank you, Commissioner. So, and then on just the topics for our bylaw review, which I think we should move to an upcoming agenda. And September just might be too busy if we really want to talk about CFAC implementation and funding. I think an hour would be warranted if I could be so bold, that really we may not even quite get to bylaws in September. But if we have a chair and vice chair, we can continue to kind of serving up meaningful agendas. But the topics we've flagged for the bylaws are expanding membership. So that is in section 3. We talked about no more than 10 per Commissioner Willis's sort of guidance that any more than 10 he would drop off, and we don't want to lose him. So right now it's 3 elected city, 3 elected county, and up to 10 would give us 5 and 5. We could consider 4 and 4. So maybe put that on for next time. And thinking caps, we know that it's very difficult to represent the size of community and the geography and diversity of Oregon with just 6 folks. So Commissioner Jacobson doing double duty, being a coastal liaison, but also our commission liaison would be, it would help her, if I may be so bold, to have a little representation from the coast on LOAC, as well as we're missing Southern Oregon and larger cities, and Central Oregon, actually. So the other item, in addition to Article 3, Section 2, that's just the number of folks. The bylaws are silent on term. So we would like to think of it as 4-year terms, but that would be something else to consider. And maybe that would be a new article between Article 3 and 4. Interestingly, in officers, it says that the officers shall serve for 2 years, but we don't talk about the term of LOAC members. So they want to fix that. And then the meetings, we do say, well, I guess this isn't a bylaw change, but just a flag for the future that in meeting section 5, LOAC will meet with LCDC during an LCDC meeting 1 time per year. So we'll want to feather in that scheduling, whether it's the November LCDC, the January or the March LCDC. Probably September is a bit too quick for everything we have on our plate. But those are the main thing: expanding the membership, defining terms of office, and then considering, it's not bylaw per se, but considering the length of time for our meetings. So that is all I had. Commissioner Jacobson on bylaws.
You are fast. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you.
Right. Yeah, so moving down just to the very end of our agenda, September meeting agenda. We already sort of talked about that, but Director Bateman, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, it's a long list of items for a short period of time. So we'll have to figure out what our priorities are there. And I do think that the CFAC implementation and funding will probably need to go first. And then we can order or prioritize the other items after that, including bylaws, if there's an opportunity. And then we just want to make sure we've signaled to folks some of the upcoming policy items so that you'll know what to keep your eye on, and maybe start conversations with those as well. Wildfire and housing needs.
Great, thank you. So look, we're right on time again. Thanks, everybody. I don't feel like I need 5 minutes to wrap it up. So if anyone else has, any of our LOAC members has something that they want to be considered for the next agenda, maybe an issue we didn't already talk about, but you want to maybe try to get on that September agenda, I think now would be the time for you to raise your hand and kind of rapid fire, and we can get those ideas possibly on our September agenda. Nothing. Okay, well, I think we do have some time till September. So if anybody thinks of anything between now and the next month or so, please send those out to Esther so that we can start working through the process of getting those on our agenda. And I just want to say thanks to everyone for participating in this. It's really nice to have the committee back up and going and kind of get more input from my fellow elected officials. And Director Bateman, anything you want to close off with?
Nope, that should do. Be safe out there.
All right, thanks everybody, and get your nominations in by the 21st. Last reminder. Yeah. All right, thanks. Bye, everybody.
Thanks so
Yeah,
much.
have a good day. All right, bye.